afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're going to spend some time today talking about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low and other types of risky cases. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder is on an E-2 visa and has also renewed this visa and is happy to share this experience. The firm is a full service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we primarily focus on E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We will continue our webinar series, doing multiple webinars a month on different immigration topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. One is the PowerPoint presentation you see here today. Another is a comprehensive E-2 visa guide, and also a link to where you can sign up for additional webinars. I will be speaking today, and my name is Kelly LeGrand Weiner. I'm the managing partner of Scott Legal and have been processing E-2 visas for over 10 years. If you have questions, please send them through the chat box. We will make time at the end of the presentation to answer some questions. We would also, ask you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel where we share multiple videos on different immigration topics that may be of interest. So I will go ahead and get started. So for the E-2 visa requirements, they're listed here and we'll run through each of them. So to qualify for an E-2 visa, you have to be a national of a treaty country. These are countries that have treaties with the United States, often reciprocal treaties, so that nationals of the United States can work in those countries. You have to own at least 50% of the E-2 company. And you have to make an investment. So this is an investor visa. The funds have to be at risk, meaning money has actually been spent. You can't just transfer money to a business bank account. It actually has to be committed to, certain expenditures for the business. You also have to prove the source of the money. So it can be any legitimate source. It can be personal savings from employment. It can be a gift from a friend or family member. It can be from a sale of personal property. A loan, secured or unsecured loan. The only caveat with the loan, which we'll talk more about later, is it cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. The investment also has to be what we call substantial, and we'll delve into what that means a little bit more later in the presentation. But there is no specific dollar figure for what is substantial. So there's many people get confused with the E-2 visa and the EB-5. The EB-5 green card is a category where there is an actual, dollar figure you have to invest, either 800,000 or $1,050,000. The E-2 visa is different than that. And so the amount just has to be substantial in relation to the type of business you're setting up. This means that for kind of service-based businesses with very low startup costs, the investment amount could potentially be quite low. Some typical E-2 expenditures, things like inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, marketing. It's really going to depend, on the type of business that you're setting up. So for example, if you're setting up a manufacturing company, obviously you will have larger expenditures and more things that are needed to get the business up and running, as opposed to if you're starting a consulting company where the actual equipment you need is much less. When you are purchasing a business, so for an E-2, you can either invest in a new startup or you can purchase an existing business. There is an ability to use an escrow arrangement and protect your investment a bit more. So in that sense, you could, sign a purchase sale agreement to purchase a company, but instead of transferring the money directly to, the seller, you could transfer it to an escrow agent. And all conditions for the sale have to have been satisfied except for the grant of the E-2 visa. If that is the only condition left, then there can be an instruction to the escrow agent that says if the E-2 visa is granted, the money will be transferred, to the seller. If the E-2 visa is denied, the money will go back to the buyer. So that is, an attractive thing about using buying a business on the E-2 is that you can protect that investment in the sense that if your E-2 visa is denied, there is an ability to kind of get that money back. Of course, you would have to be working with the seller that agrees to that arrangement. So another E2 requirement is the business cannot be marginal. And this means the business has to support more than just the investor and their family, be able to make a significant economic impact. What this really translates to is the business has to hire employees in the United States. And this is a really key part of any E2 application. The E2 is not meant for people to be, kind of solo consultants or operating a business just as a one-person, shop. They really do want to see that you are hiring people in the United States. The business also has to be real and operating. Um, this means, if it's already an existing business, maybe it's already taking in revenue, you're going to show things like tax returns, business bank statements, invoices, purchase orders, versus, if the business is a startup, real and operating means you have to show it's ready to start operating once the E2 visa is granted. So in a startup scenario, you're going to include things like a signed commercial lease, proof the business entity is established, proof you have the website set up, contracts with prospective customers. Licenses have all been acquired. These are all important to show that the business will be able to operate once the E2 is granted. Another requirement is you have to show that you, the investor, are going to develop and direct the E2 enterprise. So the E2 is not meant for people who want to be passive owners and have no involvement in the business. The E2 investor does have to plan to run the company, spend their time kind of, developing and directing the enterprise. They can, of course, and should have employees kind of doing more of the day-to-day operational tasks, but they should be working on kind of the long-term vision and business strategy for the company. Um, and finally, the E2 investor has to have the intent to return to their home country upon expiration of the E2 visa. So the standard for this is quite low. You can't kind of come out and say that you want to have a green card, but generally to meet this requirement, most applicants submit a statement affirming that they do intend to depart, if the E2 visa, ends. That being said, the E2 visa can be renewed indefinitely for as long as the company continues to meet the requirements. So it's even in the regulations that the investor is permitted to move their residence to the United States. They don't have to maintain a residence in a foreign country, but they do just have to maintain that intent to depart. All right, let's dig a little bit more into some of these requirements. As I mentioned, the treaty investor visa only allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US on this visa. It is based on where you have a passport. So certain things in immigration are based on where you're born. But for the E2 treaty investor visa, it's just based on where you have a current passport. So for example, we have many clients that perhaps were born in India, but now have become Canadian citizens, and they are able to get the E2 visa based on that Canadian passport. So options for obtaining the E2 visa, you can either purchase an existing business or start a new business in the United States. In the last slide, I mentioned, some benefits with purchasing a business are that, you can use an escrow arrangement so that if for some reason the visa is not granted, the money can be returned to you as opposed to, going directly to the seller. In a startup scenario, it can be a bit harder to recoup some of your investment because you do have to spend money on certain things. So if there's certain equipment you've purchased or you've paid for a commercial, lease and you're not able to get that money back, there is a bit more risk with that. Another benefit of purchasing an existing business is you can, if it has strong tax returns, if it has proof of employees and you intend to keep those employees, you already have proof that it has met most of those requirements. That being said, most of our clients are startups, are not purchasing a business, but are actually starting a new business. So it's even though there's a bit more risk with it, it is a very viable way to get an E2 visa. And if you're starting up a business, you're going to do things like incorporate the company, pay for all the equipment, software, insurance, marketing, licenses, everything that you need to get that company to the point where it could actually start to operate and do business. Um, the treaty countries are really, really vast. Countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. So always good to check and see if your country is on the list. Unfortunately, India and China are not, but they are always adding, or they're sometimes adding new countries as new treaties are signed. So, for example, Portugal was just added as an E2 country. A few years ago, Israel was also added. So there are kind of countries that are signing treaties that are eventually, able to apply for the E2. So another common question, how long is the E2 visa valid for? And the validity of the visa is going to depend on your nationality because it's dependent on the reciprocity between the two countries. So there's many countries where For example, you could get a 5-year visa. So, for example, Canada, the UK, these countries are issuing 5-year visas. There's some countries where it's less. Australia is 4 years. Um, Bangladesh is only 3 months. So it is important to kind of look and see, what does your country allow in terms of visa validity, and also how many entries can you have. That being said, whether you have a 3-month visa or a 5-year visa, each time you enter on the E-2 visa, you're eligible to be granted 2 years in E-2 status, meaning you could stay in the United States for up to 2 years and run the company. All right. So, how much investment is enough? This is, I think, very, very common question, very common concern. And you must invest a substantial amount of money. So, as I mentioned, there is no dollar amount no set dollar amount in the regulations anywhere, and it will depend on the type of business. They do a proportionality test for startups, which means how much have you invested versus what are the actual costs to establish that type of business. Um, Again, for a service-based business, you could, argue, I think very successfully that the startup costs are very low. We'll talk a bit more about what is too low, as certainly some things would be too low. So even though you could maybe say, I only need to invest 2,000 or I don't need to invest anything, ultimately it is an investor visa. You do need to invest, thousands of dollars in order to obtain this visa, even when you're coming with a company that has very low startup costs. Also important to consider, if you're starting up, for example, a restaurant, if you're starting up a manufacturing plant, something that has a lot of fixed costs and specialty equipment, your investment amount is going to need to be higher, or you're going to need to be able to explain to the officer, here's, I've spent everything necessary to get this business to the point of being operational. You can also include supplementary evidence that you've invested 100% or close to 100% of the investment amount, including things like a CPA letter, analyzing the investment, in light of the type of business you're starting. Also articles, from kind of business publications. I mean, there's many articles that talk about startup costs for various types of businesses. If those are favorable, you can include those as well. When you are buying a business, really, if it's an arm's length transaction, you don't know the seller. Essentially, when you're buying a business, it's really the fair market value. What is it being offered for? And you want to purchase that, then that should be considered substantial. If it is not an arm's length transaction, if you know the seller, you have a personal relationship, it can be good to get a valuation, maybe have a CPA weigh in looking at the financials to say, yes, this is a reasonable, purchase price amount. Additionally, even if it is an arm's length transaction, you want to make sure just that the financials make sense in light of the purchase price. So if the financials are showing the business has tons of assets, a lot of profit, lots of cash, and the investment amount is very low, that's something that's going to raise red flags for an officer. All right, so let's talk about some strategies to deal with a low dollar amount. If you are investing and you know that the investment amount is going to be, very low, so let's say, under $200,000, it's really important that you have a very strong application when it comes to all other aspects. So things like proof that you're going to hire employees. Maybe you hire some employees before you file. Proof of, that the company's real and operating can be really good to get client contracts. Maybe, important to show that you yourself have a background in running this type of business, or you have a successful entrepreneurial background where you've been able to run multiple different types of businesses. So all of those things are really important, so that holistically, even if you have a lower investment amount, the other aspects of your case are strong. Um, Always a good idea to get contracts or letters of intent from clients. It's very good to be able to show the officer that there's a demonstrated interest in your business. You can also maybe form relationships with kind of local business organizations, for example, the local chamber of commerce, or if there's other, business networking organizations, that you want to become a member of. If you meet with those organizations, sometimes they will write a favorable letter indicating, yes, we are excited about this business um, coming to our community. They're going to hire workers, bring in revenue. Those types of things can be favorable as well. If the company has already started operating and is doing well, is on track financially, you could also highlight that any ongoing company activity, any sales that have already been made. Although you do want to be careful with that. Let's say if you're in the United States already and you don't have the visa to work at the company, you want to make sure you would have employees that are handling those sales or that any sales are happening while you physically are outside the US. Um, a strong business plan is very important in these types of cases. It really helps the officer understand how do you plan to get to profitability, how will the business succeed, how will it be able to support employees and make a significant economic contribution. Um, Hiring employees prior to applying is always very strong. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But again, it's not required that you have employees before you file, but it is very helpful. And you could consider a CPA letter. This is, again, something where you would have a CPA look at your investment schedule, look at your business plan, the type of business you're starting. Particularly, this can be helpful if it's a CPA who works in your industry or works with a lot of businesses in this industry and is willing to write a letter explaining that this type of business can be run successfully with this type of startup investment. Right. Let's look at some common E-2 visa expenditures. So, although the expenditures will, really depend on what type of business you're starting, there are some expenditures that really usually apply across most businesses. So, most businesses are going to need a website. It's something that's very common for officers to look up the company website. So, it is important to have that piece, in place. It doesn't need to be necessarily a comprehensive website if it's not something that your type of business needs. But most, as a baseline, most companies should have that. So anything you pay to get that set up can be included. Any equipment you need, computers, printers, scanners, inventory, if it's the type of business that has inventory. Furniture, although it is important to note, furniture can only be included if it's specifically for, office, business purposes. So if you're saying, well, I'm going to have a home office and I'm going to work at my dining table and I'm also going to use it as a dining table, that's not a good E-2 expenditure. Trademark and intellectual property, can be a good expenditure. Anything you pay for employees, anything you pay to independent contractors to do work. Legal fees can be included. They are not the immigration legal fees are not the strongest expense. They are always included. But legal fees that are like, let's say you're doing business entity setup, or you pay, you're doing some type of, hedge fund and you need to pay, a lawyer to, set up that structure for you. All of those can certainly be included and are strong expenditures. Commercial lease, definitely a strong expenditure. Not again, like if you have a home office, you can't include your mortgage or your rent. That doesn't work. Kind of going through some of these quickly. Training courses, they're not the strongest. If they're directly relevant and not a huge part of the investment, they can be included to bolster the amount, but not the strongest expenditures. Purchase of real property, if it's land, and if it's going to be utilized by the business, then that certainly can be included. Cars and trucks, this is a very common question if whether this can be included. It can be only if it's really necessary for the business. So, for example, a food truck, a taxi service, construction companies will often have good reasons why they need vans. In this case, it's beneficial if it's a commercial vehicle, or if there's some kind of marketing or branding that's been put on the vehicle to show that it is going to be used not really as a personal car, but really for the business. If it's something where you say, well, I'm going to have to drive, and meet my clients, and also the car is going to be my personal car, that makes it a much weaker expense. Software and advertising are also very good, general E-2 expenses. So let's talk about some weak expenditures. So anything with travel, very, very weak. Even, we've listed here, unless for a very specific conference or business related activity, definitely on the weaker side. There's even some consulates that specifically say on their website, do not include travel, do not include flights. They don't like to see this. Adding it in really, it takes away from the strength of the application. And so we don't ever recommend including these things: travel, meals, transportation, entertainment. Also expenses if they're going to be directly reimbursed by a client or customer. So if it's inventory where you're selling at a markup, that can be included. But if it's something where, you're writing a check for 10,000 and the client's then writing you a check for 10,000, it's directly being reimbursed. That's not great. Similarly, expenses paid to related parties. So let's say that you own a few different companies, and your E2, your E2 company pays one of your other companies to set up their website. That also is not a good, expenditure. They may see that as just you transferring money between two companies you own, as opposed to you actually putting your money at risk in the commercial sense. So let's move and talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses. This is a type of business that we do a lot. We do a lot of E2s in this area, and they can be risky cases, but there's many strategies you can use to make these cases stronger. So I think one of the big challenges for consulting businesses, we have many people come in and say, I have my computer, I have my skill set and my network of connections. I don't need anything else. I don't need to spend any money. And while that may be true, ultimately, to obtain the E2 investor visa, there does need to be a substantial investment. So you have to be able to convince the officer that you are committed to successfully developing the enterprise, that you have put enough funds at risk that you will actually pursue this business venture. So their concern is if you just put, $50,000 in a U.S. business bank account, the minute you get your 5-year visa, you could just pull all of that money out. Nothing has really been committed to the business in their view. So you do want to think about spending money on items that are, useful for your business. We always want people to be spending money on things that make sense for their business. And for consulting businesses where there may not be a lot of startup costs, it can be helpful to think down the road, over the first couple years, what would the major expenditures be? Maybe I can make some of those, maybe I can make some of those expenditures now. So maybe if you're going to hire 3 people in the first couple of years, maybe you purchase some of those computers earlier than you normally would have. Maybe you, get a more extensive website than you initially planned to, or you hire a PR company to help develop a strategy for you in marketing. Perhaps you hire an employee, maybe an office administrator to help get things running for you while you're doing this application process. And anything you pay to that employee, and anything you pay to get payroll set up or any other ancillary employee expenses, all can be included in your E2 investment. Now let's move and talk about some challenges for real estate investments. So this is an area that is quite risky for the E2, just because the consulates are very sensitive to the idea that many people might want to just purchase a property, and then collect rental income, which is passive. And so that in itself is not going to be, a real and operating enterprise that's going to work for an E2. Again, on many consulate websites in the E2 FAQs, they'll have a question that says, can I just purchase a property and use that for my investment? And the answer is no, because it's not a real and operating business. So the challenge here is really to show that the business is going to earn revenue, support employees, and have, be actively trading. Um, so potential ideas, things that have worked for our clients in the past. So a brokerage firm, a property management company where you're managing multiple properties. Some people will come to us and say, well, I have a couple Airbnbs. Can that work for an E2? I'd say that's very, very risky. It's fine to start a property management company and manage a couple of your own properties, but also a better idea to expand that portfolio and to have, other outside properties that you're managing that are not just your own. Um, Renovation and construction, that can be, a very viable E2 option. And house flipping, this can potentially work, but only on a large scale. To give you an example, we had a client who had 30 or 40 properties that were being rehabilitated and sold. And so there was enough activity there, that was able to be utilized, for an E2. That being said, because of the size of the portfolio, the investment amount was very high. So sometimes if house flipping is something you're interested in, it can sometimes be a smaller part of another business. So let's say that you have a renovation and construction business, and then you put in your business plan, another thing we'll do is also, flip a certain number of homes. That can be one way to kind of, ease that concern an officer may have, because sometimes if they hear house flipping, they kind of immediately are concerned about that. All right, let's talk about trading companies. So these have many of the same concerns as real estate companies. Just is it going to be active enough? Is it going to support employees? Is somebody just going to put their stock portfolio in a business name and trade personally? So in this sense, your clients should go beyond your friends and family. You want to, be able to show that you're going to, have outside clients. Can also be helpful to hire employees. And then, and this is also a concern for real estate. It's a very heavily regulated industry. So to do certain things, you do need to have licenses. Those can be, like often very state specific. So for both real estate and for equity trading, you want to make sure that those are in place and that you can explain to the officer that you are, properly licensed to run this type of business. Particularly for real estate, sometimes, requirements for kind of getting a contractor's license or a real estate broker's license. Sometimes you need, a social security number or some kind of status. So for those situations, people will sometimes partner with another business that is licensed and provide an explanation in their application that there's a realistic runway for them to, partner with this other business, be able to operate under that license, and then get their own license, once they're in the United States. Okay, let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. So, one can be a low investment amount. So we've talked today about some strategies for dealing with low investment amounts, but there are some investments that are, just too low, right? So, we have a client that came to us and had spent, $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. So this amount is just too low. Uh, an officer is just not going to consider this to be substantial to show that the investor is actually committed to running the enterprise. In those cases, in that particular case, there was, cash available to increase the investment amount. The person ended up spending around $50,000 and ultimately was approved, with that investment of 100,000 with 50,000 spent and about 50,000 in working capital. Another reason can be the nature of the business. So we've just talked here about there are some business types that are just riskier for the E2. Things like consulting businesses where they may be concerned someone's going to come and be a solo consultant, real estate where, or equity trading where they're concerned, is there enough activity here? So if you do have a business that's kind of in a riskier area, you want to make sure you're strengthening all parts of the application. Filing location and venue are also very important for E2s. There are some venues that may accept very low investment amounts. For example, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, if you do, a change of status within the United States, they often will accept very low investments, even as low as maybe $20,000, $30,000 if it makes sense in light of the type of business. If it's a business with high startup costs, that's really not going to work. But if it's a service-based business, we have had approvals with very low investment amounts. Obviously, past results don't guarantee, future outcomes. However, it is possible, with those types of businesses to have very low investment amounts at certain venues. There's also venues that are really not great for low investment amounts. For example, many of the US consulates in Asia work a lot with very, very large companies that are investing millions of dollars. And so when they see a small business owner investing $100,000, even though that application may be very approvable at other consulates or with USCIS, sometimes they, are not. Not as favorable towards those types of applications because most of what they're seeing are investment amounts that are extremely high. So it is a good idea to always work with your attorney to figure out what are my options for my filing location and, like, is there anything that I can do to pick a more favorable filing location if my investment amount is low? Another concern, these next two are really related is concern over marginality. Is this business going to create jobs for US workers? If you've run a similar business in your home country for many years and you've never hired employees, this is definitely a red flag for them. This is something they could look at and say, well, why should we believe you're going to hire employees in the US? So if that's your situation, it can be very favorable to hire an employee before you file because now you've already addressed that concern, or to purchase a business that already has employees. So they already know off the bat this company does have employees or, will have employees. There can also be issues with the adjudicating officers. So, consular officers are human beings. There's a subjective element to how they adjudicate some of these cases. And so if you are in a situation where you feel the officer really didn't understand or didn't give a fair chance, sometimes, that can be a situation where it may be helpful to reapply. Consulates do not guarantee that you get a different officer, but they do, as a matter of practice, try to give a different officer. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. Sometimes people may file on their own, or perhaps with attorneys not as versed in the E2 requirements, and maybe they don't spend much money. Maybe they spend $10,000. That's going to really not work. Even at the very even at consulates with very familiarity with very low investment amounts, 10,000 is really not going to be viable. Or perhaps if the treaty investor doesn't own 50% of the company right off the bat, they're not going to qualify. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about some adjudication trends. The good thing about the E2 visa is that approval rates generally are quite high, between 80 to 90%. Our firm has an approval rate around 98%, although past results don't predict future outcomes. Um, Timelines, we'll talk about here. So, in London, for example, they do publicly list their timelines. They say that they take about 60 business days to review a case, and then we'll send an email allowing the applicant to set up an interview. Our experience lately is this is taking, longer than 60 working days, sometimes, even a month or two longer. Even if you do see a consulate that has the review time posted. These aren't guarantees. It's usually kind of what's the best estimate or the average processing time at a particular point in time. In Toronto, they're quite fast. If you can submit your application, and they will review it usually within 10 to 15 business days and then allow you to set up an appointment. And usually you can get an appointment within a few weeks. In general, for all the other consulates, it's really all over the place, right? So again, some of them post their processing times, some do not. There's some that have come back from COVID and are completely at normal processing times, like Toronto, like London, like Japan. There's other countries where the ability to kind of get back on track with E2 processing is really still not there, where wait times are even a year or more. So it is very consulate specific. And although it's getting much, much better, we are still seeing some knock-on effects from COVID. Um, your options when you're applying for an E2 are you can either apply for a change or extension of status with USCIS from within the United States. To take advantage of that option, you have to legally be in the United States in a status that allows you to change status. So, for example, ESTA does not allow you to change status. But if you entered as a business visitor on a B1 visa, then you would be able to change status. At a consulate, you're going to submit an application directly to the consulate, and you'll get an E2 visa stamp in your passport. Um, the benefit of the consulate is that you get that visa stamp, and so you can travel internationally. If you apply with USCIS, what you get is a 2-year approval notice. So everybody, regardless of their nationality, is going to get that 2-year approval notice. And however, like once you leave the United States, you would have to go to a consulate and submit a brand new application to get the E2 visa stamp. And the consulate doesn't have to defer to the approval by USCIS. They are going to make their own determination about whether or not they think the case meets the E2 visa requirements. Um, post specific considerations. So every post, as I mentioned, they all have different timelines. Every post is kind of its own universe when it comes to how they want the E2 visa application prepared. Most posts that do E2 visas regularly will have a list of consular instructions. Some posts don't, or it's very bare bones. But it's always good to check that. Many posts are moving towards having kind of strict requirements where with strict page limits, where if you submit anything that's over the page limits, they may send the file back to you and say, we're not going to accept this, send it back, with the exact page number that we request. Also good to take into account, consular preferences. As I mentioned previously, many consulates in Asia want to see these higher investment amounts. So you want to be thinking about that, when you're building your strategy. Also, some posts have started to require a CPA certification for business plans. For an E2, if you're doing a startup, you're almost always going to be including a business plan. And there are certain consulates that now want all those financials to be certified by a CPA. So the business plan drafting is a service that our firm does offer, and we do have a CPA on staff that can certify as well. All right, let's talk about some complex areas that come up with E2 visas. common question whether you have to hire employees before you apply. And the answer is no. There's nothing in the regulations that requires that you hire employees before you apply. That being said, as discussed throughout this presentation, there are many reasons why hiring employees could be very favorable for your application. It can allow you to build up your investment amount by anything you've paid for this employee or anything you've paid for, payroll, workman's comp, insurance, things like that. Additionally, it speaks to the marginality requirement. It shows that you're going to hire workers, that the business is going to support more than just the investor and their family. Um, the source and trail of funds is also an area that can come up and can be, quite difficult depending on where you're applying. So if you apply with USCIS, although they are, more willing to accept low investment amounts, they also have a very, very strict requirement about proving where the money came from. So, for example, if you were uh, applying at a consulate and you said, I earned this money from, savings from employment, you might be able to just submit a couple of years of tax returns and then proof of you transferring, money in a lump sum to the United States. If you were applying with USCIS, they would want to see all of the money that you earned accumulating in your bank account. So anywhere your pay stubs, your payroll, exactly where it went in your bank account, they'd want to see it there. If it was transferred out, they'd want to know where that went. They'd want to see enough money accumulate from payroll to then be transferred to the United States and then spent on E-2 expenditures. They do take a very, very strict view of proving that source and path of funds if you're applying from within the United States, whereas consulates will often take a much more high level view. Um, Other things to consider with source and trail of funds are, the options for loans and gifts. So a loan is permitted under the E-2. It can either be, a personal unsecured loan. It can also be a personal loan that is secured by personal property. The one caveat is it cannot be secured by assets of the E-2 business. Sometimes this comes up in seller financing when you're purchasing a business. So if somebody is purchasing a business and maybe they're paying 50% of the purchase price and the rest is seller financing. This can be problematic for the E-2 because, all that seller financing is, is secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So any of that 50% is not going to count as the investment. And often in that scenario, they'll find the investment is not substantial. Um, for gifts, this is fine. This is a fine way to get the investment for the E-2. However, a gift letter alone is not enough. They will also want to see where the gift giver got the money. So before you go the route of a gift, you would need to talk with the gift giver and make sure that they would feel comfortable sharing all their financials to support where they got the money. So for example, if they sold a property, they would want to see, the purchase sale agreement for the property, the proof of the person receiving the money, and then the proof of the person transferring the money, to the E-2 investor. So another thing people ask about are, can I get, two E-2 visas for two investors? And the answer is yes, that is possible. You can get two E-2 visas for one business as long as you own the business 50-50. Another issue that comes up a lot are changes to the E-2 business after filing. There are some people that might get the E-2 visa, maybe they get a 5-year visa, and they think, well, I have this visa, so now I'm just permitted to work in the United States. And that's really not true. You are permitted to work, but only for the E-2 company and only for the E-2 company as it was represented to the consulate. So if there's a change in ownership, for example, you own 50% and then, maybe you do some rounds of raising funds, or you sell a portion of the company and you no longer own 50%. Now you're no longer, really maintaining your E-2 status. So even if your visa is still valid, the fact that your ownership has dropped below 50% is problematic for continuing to stay in the US. Similarly, a change to the type of the business, that can be problematic if it's a substantial change. So let's say that you're running a wedding photography business and now you want to start up a blog that's going to kind of publicize the pictures more. That's probably fine. That's probably can be explained as a natural outgrowth of your services that you had represented to the consulate. But let's say you had a wedding photography business and now you want to shut that down and start a restaurant, but it's all under the same LLC. That would be very problematic if you did that before getting approval from the government. So anytime that there's going to be a substantial change to the business, there does need to be either approval, either from USCIS or the consulate, before that change goes into effect. We've, seen clients where unfortunately maybe they've, had their E-2 visa, And then they've come to us only after they've made changes to the business, and that can be problematic to try to get them, back into a valid status, and explain they didn't know that they couldn't shut down the business or that they couldn't completely pivot and start a brand new business. Um, Something else that comes up are family business purchases. So, very common for people to want to purchase, maybe a majority share of a business from, a brother, a sister, a cousin. This can be done. However, it does lead to more scrutiny in the application. So it is a situation where if you're purchasing from somebody you're related to or your, family friend, you probably want to get a valuation. You probably want to get somebody objective, an objective professional, a CPA evaluation company to look at the financials of the business and to write an opinion letter or valuation analysis that shows that the amount that you're paying is the fair market value based on the actual, financials of the company. All right, so now we will move to questions and answers. So I'll check here to see if we have any. So a couple have come in. So first question, how is the experience important to the industry? For example, if someone from an engineering background is looking to buy an existing convenience store, gas station, or restaurant, do they still qualify for the E-2 visa from Canada? So, yes, even if you have a different background from the type of business you're going to buy or start up, you can apply for the E-2 visa. Usually what we try to do is anything that is relevant from the person's professional background, whether it be managing people, working with financials, working with operations or processes. We always try to incorporate that in the explanation, but certainly, yes, you can start a business in an area in which you have not worked yet, or in which your educational and professional background does not exactly match. Another question, does the E-2 visa lawyer need to be located at the business address state? So no, generally immigration is federal law. So what that means is that, even if you are setting up your business, for example, in California, you can have an immigration lawyer that's located anywhere in the United States, again, because immigration law is federal and they can assist. There might be certain things that would be helpful to having a lawyer in the state where you're operating. For example, if you want a lawyer to assist you with drafting the purchase sale agreement, that's going to be something where you need a lawyer who's licensed in the state where the transaction is taking place. So, there can be benefits to it, but certainly you can have an immigration lawyer located kind of anywhere. All right. So those were all the questions that had come in. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.